I'm Madison Hayes, 28, and I grew up believing my father's approval was all that mattered. His manipulation was so subtle that I never recognized the emotional prison he'd built around me until my mother died. When he tried to seize her multi-million-dollar inheritance from me, we ended up in court where he thought his legal expertise made him invincible. But he never expected that Mom had left me more than just money. She left me the truth. Before you hear how just 2 whispered words made both my father and the judge turn pale, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button to support stories of standing up to manipulation. Growing up in Boston's affluent Beacon Hill neighborhood, our brownstone townhouse always felt more like a museum than a home. Every surface gleamed with perfection, every item had its proper place, and every family member had their assigned role. My father, Richard Hayes, made sure of that. Dad built his reputation as one of Boston's most formidable attorneys by approaching every aspect of life like a legal case, methodically, strategically, and always with victory as the only acceptable outcome. His clients loved him for this precision. His family well. We learned to adapt. Madison, he'd say, inspecting my report card with the same scrutiny he gave to legal briefs, an A-, is simply a B with good publicity. Is that the standard you're setting for yourself? Even at 9 years old, I understood that in our home, excellence wasn't celebrated, it was expected. My mother, Catherine, was different. Where Dad was sharp edges and calculated moves, Mom was gentle smiles and quiet strength. She came from old money. Her family had built a successful manufacturing business 3 generations back. But you'd never know it from her humble demeanor. "Your father just wants what's best for you," she'd whisper after he'd lecture me about a piano recital where I'd missed 3 notes. Her eyes would say something different, something sad that I couldn't quite understand until I was much older. Richard controlled everything in our household, from the major financial decisions down to the weekly menu. Mom had access to a household account that Dad funded monthly, but every purchase was scrutinized at the end of each month in what he called our family budget review, but was really just an opportunity to question Mom's judgment. $37 at the bookstore, Catherine. What could possibly warrant that expense, he'd ask, despite the fact that his own watch cost more than our monthly grocery bill. When I turned 16, Dad opened a checking account for me, but the online access was linked to his email, not mine. "This way I can help you learn responsibility," he explained. What he meant was, this way I can monitor every purchase you make. My childhood memories center around earning Dad's approval. I still remember the warm flood of relief when he'd finally nod at a piano piece perfectly performed or an essay he deemed acceptable. Those rare moments of validation became the currency I lived for, each one carefully banked in my emotional savings account for the inevitable drought that would follow. Mom tried to counterbalance Dad's rigid expectations. She'd sneak little notes in my lunchbox with phrases like, "You're perfect just as you are, and I'm proud of you every day." When Dad wasn't home, she'd crank up the radio and we'd dance around the kitchen, something that would have earned a disapproving lecture about appropriate behavior for a Hayes woman had he witnessed it. Everything changed my sophomore year at Boston University. I was studying business. Dad's choice, not mine, when Mom was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. I still remember getting the call in my dorm room, Mom's voice artificially bright as she delivered the devastating news. "It's nothing to worry about, sweetie. The doctors are very optimistic." That was Mom protecting everyone else, even when she was the one who needed protection. I wanted to drop everything and come home, but Dad insisted I maintain my full course load. "Catherine has the best oncologists in New England," he said firmly. "Your job is to focus on your education." The next 2 years became a precarious balancing act, maintaining my GPA to avoid Dad's disappointment while spending every possible moment at Mom's bedside. I'd take the T to Massachusetts General Hospital between classes, often studying by the harsh fluorescent light of her hospital room while she slept exhausted from the latest round of chemotherapy. Dad was notably absent during these hospital vigils. "Someone has to keep the firm running," he'd say when I'd question why he couldn't take more time off. "Your mother understands the importance of maintaining our lifestyle, especially with these medical bills." What he never mentioned was that Mom's family money covered most of those bills. I only learned that later. As Mom's condition worsened, I noticed a shift in our dynamics. She became more insistent that I pursue my own dreams rather than Dad's. "Life is too precious to live it for someone else, Maddie," she told me one afternoon while we sat in the hospital garden during a rare good day. "Promise me you'll remember that." During her final weeks, Mom seemed desperate to tell me something. She'd grip my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail and start sentences she couldn't finish. Your father. When I'm gone. You need to know. But either exhaustion or the arrival of a nurse would interrupt these cryptic warnings. 3 days before she died, we finally had a moment alone. The hospice nurse had stepped out and Dad was at the office as usual. Mom beckoned me closer to her bed. Madison, she whispered, her voice raspy. There's a letter in my blue jewelry box. Read it only after I'm gone. And don't tell your father. Her eyes, sunken but suddenly clear, bore into mine with an intensity that scared me. He's not who you think he is. Be careful. Before I could ask what she meant, she drifted back to sleep and we never got another private moment. She slipped away on a Tuesday morning in April, with Dad and me both at her bedside. As the machines were silenced and the nurses expressed their condolences, I glanced at my father. His face was composed appropriate for the occasion, but something in his eyes looked almost relieved. The funeral was meticulously orchestrated by Dad, of course. The right flowers, the right music, the right eulogy that spoke more about Catherine Hayes as Richard's perfect wife than as the vibrant, complex woman she actually was. I was allowed a brief reading carefully edited by Dad to ensure it was tasteful. Throughout the service, I kept noticing Dad checking his watch. Later that evening, I overheard him on the phone with his law partner, discussing a case as if it were any normal day. When I confronted him about it, his response chilled me. Life continues, Madison. Your mother understood that better than anyone. She wouldn't want us dwelling in grief. But the truth was, I don't think Dad was dwelling in grief at all. If anything, he seemed unburdened, like a man who had completed a lengthy obligation and was finally free to move on. And I was about to find out why. Number 3. The will and initial betrayal. 6 weeks after we laid Mom to rest, Dad called me to the house for what he termed an important family discussion. I was still deep in grief, moving through my days in a fog, barely managing to keep up with my final semester of classes. But when Richard Hayes summoned, you answered. I arrived at the family home on a Sunday afternoon, the May sunshine, feeling offensively cheerful against my mood. The house seemed different, somehow colder despite the spring warmth. Dad had already removed most photos of Mom from the main rooms, her absence made physical in the blank spaces on walls and shelves. Madison Dad greeted me in the foyer with a formal nod. Thank you for being prompt. Thomas is waiting in my office. Thomas the First followed him down the hallway confused. Why is your law partner here for a family discussion? Dad didn't answer, just led me into his wood-paneled office where Thomas Bradford sat with a leather portfolio on his lap. Thomas was Dad's right hand at the firm, a quiet, efficient man in his 50s who had always been cordial but distant during the firm's holiday parties. Madison, good to see you, Thomas said, not quite meeting my eyes. Please have a seat. I perched on the edge of one of the leather chairs, suddenly feeling like a client rather than a daughter. Dad took his place behind his massive desk, the power dynamics of the room immediately established. As you know, Dad began without preamble, your mother's passing necessitates certain legal and financial arrangements. I knotted my throat tight. I'd expected this conversation eventually, but it felt too soon, too businesslike. What you may not know, he continued, sliding a document across the desk toward me, is that your mother maintained a separate estate from our joint holdings. This was indeed news to me. In our family, financial discussions were Dad's domain, and any questions were dismissed as nothing you need to concern yourself with. Separate estate, he echoed. Yes, Thomas interjected, clearly uncomfortable. Your maternal grandparents established a significant trust for Catherine that per their stipulations remained separate from marital assets. Dad's face tightened, almost imperceptibly. A rather old-fashioned arrangement that caused unnecessary complications. And I prompted, sensing there was more. And Dad continued, his voice clipped. Your mother saw fit to designate you as the sole beneficiary of this trust in her will. The air seemed to thicken around me. Me, not you. A flash of something resentment crossed Dad's face before his attorney mask slipped back into place. That's correct. However, given your inexperience with financial matters of this magnitude, Thomas and I have prepared a management arrangement. He pushed another document toward me. This gives me power of attorney over the trust assets, allowing me to administer them on your behalf until you reach a more appropriate age for such responsibility. What is this magnitude we're talking about? I asked, finding my voice. And what's the appropriate age? I'm 28, Dad. Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. The Hayes Manufacturing Trust is valued at approximately $17 million, Madison. The room seemed to tilt. $17 million. How had I never known about this, and why would Dad need power of attorney over my inheritance? I don't understand, I said slowly. Why wouldn't Mom have discussed this with me? Your mother tended towards sentimentality over practicality, Dad said dismissively. She likely didn't want to burden you. Which is why it's fortunate that I'm here to guide you through this process. He extended an expensive pen toward me. If you'll just sign these papers, we can handle everything smoothly. Something in his tone, that familiar, controlling tone that brooked no argument, sparked a memory of my mother's last warning. He's not who you think he is. Be careful. I think I'd like some time to review these documents before signing, I said, not reaching for the pen. Dad's expression hardened. Madison, there's nothing to review. This is a standard arrangement that Thomas and I have prepared specifically with your interests in mind. Still, I insisted, surprising myself with my firmness. I'd like some time. Dad set the pen down with deliberate control. I see. Perhaps you don't appreciate the complexity of managing assets of this nature. This isn't some frivolous decision like changing your major from business to that art history nonsense you were always going on about. There it was, the slight, the reminder of how my own choices had always been devalued. It's not about appreciation, Dad. It's about understanding what I'm signing. Dad exchanged glances with Thomas, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Very well, Dad finally said. Take the documents. But Madison, his voice dropped to that quiet, threatening tone I knew all too well. Consider carefully before you make decisions you'll regret. Family matters should stay within the family. As I gathered the papers and stood to leave, I felt a strange mixture of fear and something else, something that felt strangely like power. For the first time, I had something. Dad wanted something he couldn't simply command. I'll be in touch, I said, walking out without waiting for his dismissal. Another first. That night in my apartment, I stared at the legal documents, the dense language swimming before my tired eyes. The magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. Mom had left me financially independent from my father, and he was clearly unhappy about it. But why Dad had his own successful law practice and had never seemed concerned about money? Unless controlling the money was just another way of controlling me. I tossed and turned all night, torn between my lifelong habit of acquiescing to Dad's wishes and the nagging feeling that Mom had intended this inheritance as some kind of protection from the very man who was now trying to get me to sign it away. By morning, I had made my decision. For once in my life, I wouldn't simply do as Richard Hayes commanded. I would find out what my mother had wanted for me no matter what. $17 million. Rachel nearly choked on her coffee. Are you serious? We were sitting in a corner booth at our favorite cafe, far from any familiar faces who might report back to my father. Rachel Wilson had been my roommate in college and now worked as an accountant. If anyone could help me make sense of my inheritance, it was her. According to Thomas, yes. But I don't understand how Mom could have kept this from me. Or how Dad could have been okay with not controlling it. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Who says he was okay with it? Madison, you've told me enough about your dad over the years to know he's not exactly the type to relinquish control willingly. I pushed the legal documents across the table to her. That's why I brought these. Can you tell me what they actually mean? In plain English. Rachel spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the papers, her frown deepening with each page. Finally, she looked up. Maddie, if you sign this, you're essentially giving your father complete control over your inheritance. Not temporary control, complete. There's language in here that would make it nearly impossible for you to revoke the power of attorney without his consent. Miss Stomach dropped. Are you sure? I'm not a lawyer, but these provisions, she pointed to a particularly dense paragraph. This isn't about protecting you. This is about legally transferring control of your assets. But why Dad doesn't need the money? Rachel closed the folder and leaned forward. Maybe it's not about the money itself. Maybe it's about what the money represents. Which is what? Independence. Freedom from his control. She reached across the table and gripped my hand. Madison, you need to talk to an actual estate attorney. Someone who isn't connected to your father, By that afternoon, I was sitting in the office of Sarah Winters, an estate law specialist whose name Rachel had provided. Sarah was in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me ironically of my father. Based on my review, Sarah said after examining the documents, this power of attorney agreement is aggressively one-sided. I wouldn't advise any client of mine to sign this regardless of their relationship with the other party. What should I do? I asked. First, we need to get a copy of your mother's actual will and any trust documents. Then we can determine exactly what your rights are. She looked at me intently. Are you prepared for this to potentially create conflict with your father? I thought about Mom's warning about the way Dad had tried to rush me into signing over my inheritance. I think the conflict has already started. I just didn't know it until now. When I checked my phone after the meeting, I found 6 missed calls from my father. I listened to his progressively angrier voicemails with a growing sense of dread. Madison, call me immediately. Madison, I spoke with Thomas. Where have you taken those documents? This behavior is unacceptable. Return my calls now. I'm beginning to question your judgment. This is exactly why these arrangements are necessary. The final message chilled me to the bone. You're making a serious mistake. Don't force my hand on this, Madison. Force his hand? What did that mean? I found out the next day when Thomas Bradford showed up unannounced at my apartment door, another set of documents in hand. Your father asked me to deliver these personally, he said, looking uncomfortable. He'd like you to reconsider your position. Thomas, I said, not taking the envelope, why are you doing this? This doesn't feel right and I think you know it. Thomas's professional facade cracked slightly. Madison, I've worked with your father for 25 years. I'd advise you to consider his offer carefully. Is that legal advice or personal advice? He hesitated. Just be careful. Richard doesn't handle opposition well. After Thomas left, I called Sarah and told her about the visit. This is concerning, but not surprising, she said. High-powered attorneys like your father are used to getting their way. We need to move quickly to secure your position. Over the next week, things escalated rapidly. First came a formal letter from Dad's law firm, not just from him, but from the entire partnership, expressing grave concerns about my mental state following my mother's death, and suggesting I was in no condition to manage substantial assets. This is a scare tactic, Sarah assured me, though she looked worried. But it shows he's willing to play hardball. Then came the calls to my workplace. My boss called me into his office, concerned. Madison, is everything all right? Your father called expressing concern about your well-being. He mentioned potential erratic behavior and suggested you might need a leave of absence. I managed to convince him I was fine, but the damage was done. Suddenly, colleagues were looking at me differently, whispering when I passed. My father had masterfully planted seeds of doubt about my stability. Next, friends started reaching out, saying Dad had contacted them too. He seems really worried about you, Maddie, my friend, Jennifer texted. Maybe you should talk to him. The walls were closing in. Dad was systematically isolating me, using his connections and reputation to paint me as unstable and untrustworthy. It was working. With each passing day, I felt more alone, more uncertain. Was I overreacting? Was I making a mistake by defying him? Those lifelong doubts, carefully cultivated by years of subtle undermining, came flooding back. I called Rachel in tears. I can't do this, I sobbed. Maybe I should just sign the papers. It's not worth it. Madison Hayes Rachel said firmly, don't you dare give in. Your mother left you that money for a reason. She wanted you to be independent from him. But he's everywhere, Rachel. He's turning everyone against me. I can't fight someone like him. You're not alone. And we're going to find out exactly what your mother was trying to protect you from. The breaking point came 3 weeks after my initial refusal to sign. Dad called me directly, his voice icily calm. Madison, I've tried to handle this privately, but you've left me no choice. I've filed a petition to contest Catherine's will on grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. What? I gasped. You're saying Mom wasn't mentally competent when she made her will? The documents have been filed. My counsel will be in touch. The line went dead, and I stood there in shock. My own father was willing to publicly malign my mother's mental state, to drag her name through legal proceedings, just to maintain control over me and the money she'd left to protect me. That night, lying awake at 3 a.m., I finally understood what I was really up against. This wasn't just about money. This was about a lifetime of control, manipulation, and emotional abuse, so subtle I hadn't even recognized it. My mother had seen it, had tried to break the cycle, and now it was up to me to finish what she'd started. I picked up my phone and texted Sarah, "I'm ready to fight back, whatever it takes." The problem, Sarah explained as she spread documents across her conference room table, is that your father has a significant advantage. He's a respected attorney with decades of relationships in the Boston legal community. And he's not afraid to use them. It was a week after Dad had filed to contest the will, and Sarah had called an emergency strategy session. The legal challenge was even more aggressive than we'd anticipated, painting a picture of my mother as mentally compromised by medication and unduly influenced by unnamed third parties. "Does he actually have a case?" I asked, scanning the court filings with growing horror. "Not a strong one, but he doesn't need to win outright. He just needs to make the process so painful and protracted that you give up." Sarah pulled out another document. "But we found something concerning in your parents' estate planning history. Take a look at this." It was a document from 10 years earlier, a family trust agreement I vaguely remembered signing when I turned 18. Sarah pointed to a clause buried deep in the legal jargon. "This grants your father extraordinary control over any assets you might inherit, citing your demonstrated lack of financial responsibility." Do you remember agreeing to this characterization of yourself? I shook my head, feeling sick. I was just signing where they told me to. Dad said it was standard family planning. It's far from standard. Combined with some of these other documents, it creates a paper trail suggesting you've acknowledged financial incompetence. Sarah's expression was grave. "He's been planning this for years, Madison." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Even back then, Dad had been laying groundwork to maintain control over any assets I might someday inherit, including Mom's family money. "There's more," Sarah continued. "We need to determine if your mother was trying to protect herself financially from your father. Was there anything she might have left behind? Journals, correspondence records?" Mom's last words echoed in my head. "There's a letter in my blue jewelry box." "The blue jewelry box," I whispered. "I never checked it after she died." Dad packed away most of her things. That weekend, I waited until I knew my father would be at his golf club before returning to the family home. I still had a key, and the housekeeper, who had always been fond of me and my mother, let me in without question. "I just need to get a few of Mom's things," I explained. "For a memorial project." Mrs. Castillo nodded sympathetically. "Take what you need, Carita. Your mother would want you to have her treasures." I made my way to my parents' bedroom now, just my father's bedroom. All traces of Mom had been erased, her dresser emptied, her books removed from the bedside table. It was as if 28 years of marriage had been neatly expunged from the record. The walk-in closet had been similarly transformed. Dad's suits and ties hung in perfect order, with no sign of Mom's dresses or shoes. I began to panic. Had he gotten rid of everything already? Then I noticed a stack of storage boxes on the high shelf. Climbing on a step stool, I pulled them down one by one until I found what I was looking for, a container labeled Catherine Personal Items in Dad's precise handwriting. Inside were Mom's jewelry boxes, including the blue lacquered one she'd specifically mentioned. My hands trembled as I opened it. Among the necklaces and earrings was a sealed envelope with my name written in Mom's elegant handwriting. I was about to open it when I heard the front door close downstairs. Voices, Mrs. Castillo's and another, Dad. He was home early. Heart pounding, I quickly replaced everything except the blue box, which I shoved into my bag. I had just made it out of the closet when the bedroom door opened. "Madison, what are you doing here?" Dad stood in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled anger. "I just came to get some of Mom's things," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mementos." His eyes narrowed. "You should have asked me first. This is still my home." "They're Mom's things, Dad." "I think I have a right to some keepsakes." "What have you taken?" He stepped forward, looking at my bag. "Just a few pieces of jewelry. Nothing valuable, just sentimental." He seemed about to demand to see the contents, then stopped himself. "This behavior, the sneaking around it, only reinforces my concerns about your judgment, Madison." "I wasn't sneaking. Mrs. Castillo let me in." "Mrs. Castillo works for me, not you." His voice was cold. "I think it's time you left." I managed to leave without him discovering the jewelry box, but the encounter left me shaking. Back in my apartment, I finally opened Mom's letter. "My dearest Madison," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've remembered my message about the blue box. There are things you need to know about your father that I've never had the courage to tell you while I was alive." What followed was heartbreaking. Pages of Mom's neat handwriting detailing years of financial control and emotional manipulation. Dad had systematically isolated her from her family, taken control of her inheritance through a combination of legal maneuvering and emotional pressure, and created a paper trail painting her as financially irresponsible. "I let this happen," Mom wrote. "I thought I was keeping the peace, protecting our family. But all I did was teach you that this treatment was normal. My greatest regret is not standing up to him sooner, not just for me, but for you." The letter explained that Mom had secretly been working with her own attorney for years, documenting Dad's behavior and gradually regaining control of her separate assets. "The trust fund she'd left me was the culmination of that work money she'd managed to legally protect from Dad's control. There's more evidence in the family safe," she wrote. "Richard doesn't know that I know the combination. It's behind the Monet reproduction in his office, 432618. Be careful, Madison. Your father will not give up control willingly." Accompanying the letter was a USB drive. When I plugged it into my laptop, I found dozens of audio recordings, conversations between my parents where Dad's controlling behavior was on full display, financial documents showing how he'd misappropriated funds from Mom's family trust, and correspondence with Mom's attorney, documenting the steps she'd taken to protect her assets. I immediately called Sarah and told her what I'd found. "This is exactly what we need," she said, her voice tight, with controlled excitement. "But Madison, if even half of what you're describing is accurate, your father's reaction when this comes to light will be severe. Are you prepared for that?" Was I? This would mean not just standing up to my father, but exposing him, destroying the carefully crafted image he'd built over decades. It would mean publicly acknowledging that my childhood, which had looked so perfect from the outside, had been built on manipulation and control. I need to think I told Sarah. That night, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my mother's sister, Eleanor. Mom and Aunt Eleanor had been close when I was very young, but she had gradually disappeared from our lives. Dad had always dismissed her as unreliable and a bad influence. Madison Eleanor's voice was cautious when she answered my call. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Aunt Eleanor. I need to talk to you about Mom and Dad." The floodgates opened. Eleanor confirmed everything in Mom's letter and more. She hadn't abandoned us. Dad had systematically cut her out, refusing to let her visit, returning her letters, telling Mom that Eleanor had said hurtful things that she never actually said. "I tried for years to stay in touch," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "Richard threatened legal action if I interfered with his family. The only news I got of Catherine was through mutual friends and then the cancer diagnosis." She trailed off, overcome. "Why didn't Mom just leave him?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me since reading her letter. By the time she fully understood what was happening, she felt trapped. Richard had isolated her, convinced her she couldn't manage without him. And then there was you. She was afraid of losing custody. Your father had created a paper trail, suggesting she was unstable, financially irresponsible. Sound familiar? It did, terrifyingly so. Dad was using the same playbook against me that he had used against Mom. "The last time I spoke to Catherine," Eleanor continued, "was about 6 months before she passed. She told me she was finally getting her affairs in order, making sure you would be protected. She was so worried about you, Madison. After talking with Eleanor, I made my decision. I called Sarah first thing the next morning. I want to go forward," I told her. "Not just defending against Dad's petition, but filing a countersuit based on Mom's evidence." "It's going to get ugly," Sarah warned. "It's already ugly. At least now the truth will come out." That night, I barely slept. Tomorrow would be our first court appearance, the beginning of a battle I never thought I'd have to fight against the man who was supposed to have protected me. As I stared at the ceiling, I tried to find comfort in Mom's words from her letter. "You were stronger than you know, Madison. Stronger than I was. Trust yourself." I hoped she was right. The Suffolk County Courthouse loomed against the gray Boston sky, its imposing granite facade suddenly seeming ominous rather than majestic. I'd passed this building countless times without a second thought. Now I was about to enter it as a participant in the very kind of legal battle my father had described to me over dinner tables for years. Remember, Sarah said as we climbed the stone steps, this is just a preliminary hearing. Judge Martinez will establish the framework for how the case will proceed. Your father's team will try to set the tone, but we don't need to show all our cards today. I nodded, but my attention was caught by a familiar group ascending the steps ahead of us. Dad, impeccable in one of his trademark charcoal suits, surrounded by a phalanx of associates from his firm. I'd expected Thomas to be there, but the presence of 3 additional attorneys sent a clear message Richard Hayes was bringing his full legal firepower to bear. Dad caught sight of me and paused momentarily, his expression unreadable. Then, without acknowledgement, he continued up the steps, his team closing ranks around him. Intimidation tactics, Sarah murmured. Don't let it get to you. Inside, the courtroom was all polished wood and green leather, the weight of tradition palpable in every corner. I'd visited Dad at court a few times as a child, always bursting with pride at seeing him in his element, commanding the room with his presence. Now, that same presence felt threatening. Judge Rebecca Martinez entered, and the bailiff called for all to rise. She was in her 60s, with steel gray haircut and a practical bob, and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Dad had mentioned her before, a no-nonsense jurist with little patience for legal theatrics. Be seated, she directed, adjusting her glasses to review the docket. Hayes v. Hayes. Petition to contest the last will and testament of Catherine Elizabeth Hayes, with a counter motion to dismiss. She looked up, surveying the room. That's quite a showing of legal talent for a preliminary hearing, Mr. Hayes. Dad stood, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, given the complexity and sensitivity of this matter, thorough representation seemed prudent. Judge Martinez's expression didn't change. Miss Winters, you're representing the respondent. Sarah rose. Yes, Your Honor. Madison Hayes. Very well. Mr. Hayes, as petitioner, you may begin. What followed was a masterclass in character assassination dressed up as legal argument. Dad's lead counsel, Martin Blackwell, a partner I'd met at firm events but barely knew, laid out their case with surgical precision. Your Honor, this case centers on the undue influence exerted over Catherine Hayes during her final illness, resulting in a will that diverts substantial family assets against prior established agreements. Mrs. Hayes was under the influence of powerful medications that affected her judgment, making her susceptible to manipulation. He went on to paint a picture of me as emotionally unstable following my mother's death, financially irresponsible, and potentially under the influence of outside parties seeking to exploit the Hayes family resources. He referenced documented concerns about my financial judgment, dating back years, the very paper trail Sarah had warned me about. As if this character assassination wasn't enough, Martin then called their first witness, Dr. Raymond Phillips, who identified himself as one of Mom's oncologists. Dr. Phillips, Martin began. Can you describe Catherine Hayes's mental state during the final months of her treatment? Dr. Phillips, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. Mrs. Hayes was on a significant regimen of pain management drugs, including opioids. These medications can certainly affect cognitive function, particularly with complex decision-making. And would you consider estate planning to involve complex decision-making? Objection, Sarah said, rising. Calls for speculation outside the witness's expertise. Sustained, Judge Martinez said. Martin smoothly pivoted. Dr. Phillips, did you observe any changes in Mrs. Hayes's behavior that might indicate compromised judgment? Mrs. Hayes occasionally exhibited confusion during our consultations. This is not uncommon with the medication cocktail she was receiving. With each word, I felt my mother's memory being tarnished. Dad sat at the counsel table, face impassive, as his team systematically dismantled Mom's competence and, by extension, her final wishes. Next came Carol Denton, our family financial advisor, or rather, Dad's financial advisor, as I was now realizing. Miss Denton Martin asked, in your professional dealings with the Hayes family, who typically handled financial matters, Richard Hayes managed all major financial decisions, Carol replied promptly. Catherine deferred to his expertise on these matters. Did Catherine Hayes ever independently engage you for financial planning? No. Our consultations always included Richard at Catherine's request. I knew this was a lie. Mom had mentioned several private financial conversations in her letter, specifically saying she'd kept them from Dad. I scribbled a note to Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The most devastating testimony came from my second cousin Jeremy, whom I barely knew. He described a family gathering 6 months before Mom's death where I had supposedly broken down, declaring I was unable to handle adult responsibilities and needed Dad's guidance for everything. I stared at him in shock. This event had never happened. Objection, Sarah called. Hearsay and lack of foundation. We have no evidence this gathering even occurred. Your Honor, Martin countered smoothly. This witness is providing first-hand testimony about statements made in his presence. I'll allow it, Judge Martinez said, but the court notes the contested nature of this account. By the time the court recessed for lunch, I felt shell-shocked. Dad's team had presented a completely fabricated narrative supported by either manipulated or outright false testimony. The worst part was seeing how Judge Martinez was taking it all in, with a neutral expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Sarah pulled me into an alcove. It's going exactly as I expected, she said grimly. Your father has clearly been planning this for some time. But don't worry, we haven't shown our hand yet. They're lying, I hissed. All of them. That family gathering Jeremy described, it never happened. I know. And we'll address that when it's our turn. For now, just stay calm. Judge Martinez isn't as convinced as she might appear. She's seen these tactics before. As we spoke, I noticed Thomas Bradford standing alone by a window away from the cluster of Dad's legal team. Our eyes met briefly, and I was surprised to see what looked like genuine discomfort in his expression. When court resumed, Dad's team called 2 more witnesses, a nurse who had observed me arguing with my mother in the hospital, another fabrication, and a financial expert who testified about the devastating consequences of allowing an inexperienced individual to manage substantial assets. Finally, it was our turn. Sarah approached the podium with calm confidence. Your Honor, the case presented by the petitioner is built on a foundation of misrepresentations and carefully constructed false narratives. Before I call our first witness, I would like to address the most glaring issue: Richard Hayes' claim that his late wife was mentally incompetent when executing her will. She produced a document. This is a neuropsychological evaluation performed on Catherine Hayes 2 weeks before she updated her will. It was conducted by Dr. Elena Wasserman, a respected specialist with no prior connection to the Hayes family, specifically to establish Mrs. Hayes' testamentary capacity. I saw Dad shift slightly in his seat, the first crack in his composed facade. The evaluation conclusively establishes that despite her illness, Catherine Hayes was fully competent to make financial and legal decisions. Dr. Wasserman is present today and prepared to testify. Judge Martinez accepted the document, reviewing it carefully. Furthermore, Sarah continued, we have evidence that Richard Hayes has engaged in a pattern of financial control and manipulation regarding his wife's separate assets dating back years before her illness. The afternoon proceeded with our witnesses, Dr. Wasserman confirming Mom's mental competence, Aunt Eleanor testifying about Dad's systematic isolation of Mom from her family, and finally me. Taking the stand was terrifying. Looking out at the courtroom, seeing my father's cold stare, I nearly froze. But then I remembered Mom's letter, her courage in finally standing up to him, and I found my voice. I testified about finding Mom's letter, about the years of subtle control I'd experienced, about the threats and manipulation that had escalated since I'd refused to sign over my inheritance. Sarah carefully led me through each point, establishing the timeline of events. During cross-examination, Martin tried to paint me as emotionally unstable, suggesting my allegations were the product of grief and resentment. Isn't it true, Miss Hayes, he asked, that you've been under considerable emotional strain since your mother's passing? Yes, I answered honestly. Losing my mother was devastating. Finding out my father had been financially manipulating her for years and is now trying to do the same to me has been additionally traumatic. Martin's eyes narrowed at my direct response. And these supposed revelations about your father, they conveniently emerged only after you stood to inherit a significant sum, did they not? They emerged after I found the letter and evidence my mother had hidden because she was afraid of my father's reaction, I replied steadily. The same father who's now trying to declare her mentally incompetent rather than accept her wishes. By the end of the day, the courtroom was thick with tension. Judge Martinez called both counsels to the bench for a conference, then addressed the court. We'll continue these proceedings next Monday. In the meantime, both parties are to refrain from discussing this case outside this courtroom. Mr. Hayes, Miss Hayes, she looked at us each in turn. I strongly encourage you both to consider whether this family matter might be better resolved through mediation rather than continued litigation. As we were gathering our things, I noticed Thomas again hanging back from the rest of Dad's team. He caught my eye and gave a slight nod as if acknowledging something unspoken. Outside on the courthouse steps, Dad suddenly approached me, dismissing his attorneys with a wave. "Madison," he said, his voice low, "this public spectacle isn't necessary. You're embarrassing yourself and damaging our family's reputation." "I'm defending Mom's wishes," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "And myself." "You have no idea what you're doing," he hissed. "I made this family. Everything. You have your education, your opportunities, your position in society you owe to me." "No, Dad," I said, finding a strength I didn't know I possessed. "Mom built half of this family. And what you call position in society looks a lot like a prison from where I'm standing." His face flushed with anger. "You ungrateful." Mr. Hayes Sarah interrupted smoothly, stepping to my side. "I suggest you communicate with your daughter through counsel from this point forward." Dad's eyes flashed dangerously. "This isn't over, Madison. Not by a long shot." As he strode away, Sarah squeezed my arm. "You did well today. But that man is dangerous when cornered, and he's beginning to realize he's losing control of the narrative." Looking at my father's retreating back, I felt a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I know," I said quietly. "But I'm not backing down. Not anymore." The weekend after our first court appearance passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah and I worked through stacks of financial records correlating dates and transactions with the evidence from Mom's USB drive. The picture that emerged was damning. Dad had been systematically controlling and, in some cases, misappropriating funds from Mom's family trust for years. "He was careful," Sarah observed, "but not careful enough. Once we know what to look for, the pattern is clear." What we lacked was access to Mom's evidence in the family safe. Dad would surely have secured it by now, especially after my unauthorized visit to the house. But without those documents, our case had gaps that Dad's legal team could exploit. "We need to file an emergency motion for discovery," Sarah decided. "Force him to produce all financial records related to Catherine's estate." Sunday evening, exhausted from poring over documents all weekend, I returned to my apartment to find Thomas Bradford waiting in the lobby. "Madison," he said, glancing around nervously. "I need to speak with you privately." I hesitated, suspicious of his motives. "Thomas, you're representing my father. We shouldn't be talking." "Not here," he insisted. "And not as his attorney. Please, it's important." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe several blocks away. Thomas looked haggard, the polished attorney facade crumbling around the edges. "I've worked with your father for 25 years, he began without preamble. "I've overlooked a lot of aggressive tactics in the name of zealous representation. But what he's doing now," he shook his head. "It crosses lines, Madison. Professional and ethical lines." "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas stared into his untouched coffee. "Your mother was a good woman. She didn't deserve what Richard did to her. And you don't deserve what he's trying to do to you. If you feel that way, why are you helping him?" "I'm not. Not anymore." He slid a manila envelope across the table. "I've recused myself from the case effective tomorrow morning. But before I go, you should have this." Inside the envelope was a copy of a memo from Dad to Martin Blackwell, dated 2 days before our court appearance. It outlined their strategy in explicit detail, including coaching witnesses to provide false testimony and plans to portray me as emotionally unstable. This is witness tampering," I said, stunned. Among other things, Thomas agreed grimly. "There's more. Richard has been monitoring your movements, your phone calls, even your bank transactions. He has someone watching your apartment." Cold fear washed over me. "Why?" "The money's already protected in the trust. It's not about the money anymore, Madison. It's about control. It always has been." Thomas hesitated. "There's something else you should know. The safe in Richard's office, it's been emptied. Whatever was in there, he's moved it." My heart sank. The evidence Mom had mentioned was gone. But Thomas continued, "I know where it is. Richard asked me to secure certain documents in the firm's vault. I didn't know what they were at the time, but after seeing the case unfold," he pushed a key across the table. "Box 247. The security code is 8294. I stared at the key, hardly daring to believe it. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas finally met my eyes. "Because 25 years is too long to ignore your conscience. And because I have a daughter about your age." He stood to leave. "I can't testify against Richard attorney-client privilege. But I can give you the means to find the truth yourself." Early Monday morning, before the firm's regular hours, I met Sarah outside Bradford and Hayes. Thomas had left instructions with security to admit me, and we made our way to the records room in the basement. Box 247 contained exactly what we needed: the original documents from the family safe, including financial records showing Dad's systematic misappropriation of funds from Mom's trust. Most damning of all was a conversation between Dad and Mom 6 months before her death, where he explicitly threatened to have her declared incompetent if she didn't cooperate with his financial plans. His voice was cold, calculating, and unmistakably threatening. "This is exactly what we need," Sarah said, carefully securing the evidence. "With this, plus Thomas's recusal, which will raise serious questions by itself, we have enough to not just defeat Richard's petition, but potentially pursue legal action against him." We filed an emergency motion to present the new evidence that afternoon. Dad's response was swift and furious, a barrage of objections and counter-motions attempting to exclude the documents on procedural grounds. But Judge Martinez, after reviewing the evidence in chambers, denied his motions. That evening, my phone rang Dad's number. Against Sarah's advice, I answered. "Where did you get those documents?" he demanded, without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "That doesn't matter, Dad. What matters is what they show about what you did to Mom. What you tried to do to me. You have no idea what you're playing with," he snarled. "Those documents are meaningless without context. If you think this will end well for you, you're deluding yourself. It's over, Dad. The truth is coming out. Nothing is over until I say it's over." His control finally snapped, his voice rising to a shout. "I built everything you have. I can tear it all down just as easily. By the time I'm finished, you'll be begging me to take control of that money if there's any left after I'm done with you." I recorded the entire call, one more piece of evidence showing his true character. "Sarah," I said when I called her immediately after, "I think we need to go further than just defending against Dad's petition. I want to bring this all into the open. Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. Your father will fight with everything he has." I thought about Mom's journal, about the years she spent trapped in Dad's control, about how he was now trying to do the same to me. "I'm sure," I said firmly. "No more hiding. No more manipulation." The next day, Sarah and I formulated our strategy for the final hearing. We would present not just a defense against Dad's petition, but a comprehensive exposure of his pattern of financial and emotional abuse. It was a risk judges generally preferred to keep probate matters narrow in scope, but given the evidence we now had, we believed Judge Martinez would allow it. Madison, Sarah said as we finalized our approach, "Are you prepared for what this will mean? Publicly exposing your father like this will have consequences beyond just this case." I nodded, feeling strangely calm. "I know. But I'm done being controlled by fear of him. Mom spent years documenting all this, but never found the courage to use it. I need to finish what she started." That night, I found myself sorting through old family photos, holidays, vacations, graduations, all carefully staged to project the image of a perfect family. In almost every picture, Dad stood slightly apart, his hand resting possessively on Mom's shoulder or my back. How had I never noticed the pattern before? The way Mom's smile never quite reached her eyes, the slight tension in her posture whenever Dad was near. "I see it now, Mom," I whispered to a photo of her. "And I won't let him do it anymore." The stage was set for our final confrontation. I slept surprisingly well that night, as if a great weight had already been lifted. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, I had already claimed the most important victory. I was no longer under my father's control. The morning of the final hearing dawned with an unusual clarity. Boston's typical February gloom had given way to sharp winter sunshine that seemed to define every edge and shadow with uncomfortable precision, much like the truths that would be exposed today. The courtroom was more crowded than before. Word had apparently spread that the prestigious Richard Hayes was facing serious allegations in what had begun as a routine will contest. I spotted several attorneys from other firms, court reporters, and even a sketch artist tucked into the back row. Dad arrived, surrounded by an even larger legal entourage, Martin Blackwell at his side. Thomas's absence was conspicuous. Dad met my eyes briefly as he entered, his gaze cold and dismissive, as if I were merely an annoying complication to be dealt with efficiently. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Martinez entered. She surveyed the crowded courtroom with a slight frown. "I see we've attracted an audience," she observed dryly. "I remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a theater." She turned to the attorneys. "Miss Winters, you filed an emergency motion to present new evidence. Are you prepared to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, rising. "And Mr. Blackwell, I've reviewed your objections, which are noted but overruled. The court will hear this evidence." Dad leaned toward Martin, whispering urgently. Martin nodded, then stood. "Your Honor, before we proceed, we would like to raise concerns about the chain of custody for these supposed documents. We have reason to believe they may have been obtained improperly." Judge Martinez peered over her glasses. "That's a serious allegation, Counselor. Do you have evidence to support it?" "We're prepared to demonstrate that the respondent gained unauthorized access to Mr. Hayes's private office and—" "Your Honor," Sarah interrupted, "the documents in question belonged to Catherine Hayes and were specifically referenced in correspondence she left for her daughter. Moreover, they were being deliberately concealed to prevent their use in these proceedings." Judge Martinez considered this. "I'll hear the evidence and determine its admissibility based on content and relevance. Proceed, Miss Winters." Sarah began methodically presenting our new evidence, the financial records showing Dad's manipulation of Mom's trust, the journal entries documenting his controlling behavior, and finally the recording of Dad threatening Mom. The courtroom fell silent as his voice filled the room. "If you continue with this nonsense about your money, Catherine, I'll have you declared incompetent faster than you can imagine. Who do you think the courts will believe? A respected attorney or a cancer patient on opioids?" I watched Dad's face as the recording played. He maintained his composure, but a muscle twitched in his jaw, and his knuckles whitened where he gripped the table. "Your Honor," Martin protested when the recording ended, "this is clearly taken out of context. Mr. Hayes was merely expressing frustration during a difficult time for the family. Is threatening to have his wife declared incompetent a typical expression of frustration in the Hayes household?" Judge Martinez asked, her tone deceptively mild. Furthermore, Sarah continued, "We have evidence that Mr. Hayes has been engaging in similar tactics with Madison Hayes, including surveillance, financial monitoring without consent, and attempts to isolate her socially and professionally. I was called to testify again, this time about the escalating pattern of manipulation since I'd refused to sign over control of my inheritance. I described the calls to my workplace, the pressure on friends, the implicit and explicit threats. Dad watched me testify with an expression of cold calculation that I recognized all too well. He was already formulating his counter-strategy, assessing angles of attack. During cross-examination, Martin tried to paint me as paranoid, suggesting I was seeing manipulation where there was only fatherly concern. "Isn't it possible," he asked, "that your father's actions were motivated by legitimate worry about your well-being following your mother's death?" "Is it legitimate worry to tell my boss I might be mentally unstable?" I responded. "Is it fatherly concern to threaten me on the phone, saying he'd tear down everything I have?" Martin's strategy shifted. "Miss Hayes, would you describe yourself as someone who holds grudges?" "Objection," Sarah called. "Relevance." "I'm exploring the witness's potential bias, Your Honor," Martin explained. "I'll allow it," Judge Martinez said. "The witness may answer." I considered the question. "I don't think of myself that way, no. Yet here you are pursuing a vendetta against your father that goes far beyond the scope of a simple will contest. I'm defending myself and honoring my mother's wishes. That's not a vendetta." Martin's smile was cold. "No further questions, Your Honor." The morning proceeded with testimony from Aunt Eleanor about Dad's isolation tactics, followed by a forensic accountant who analyzed the pattern of financial control evident in the records. As lunchtime approached, Judge Martinez called for a recess. "We'll resume at 1 o'clock. Mr. Blackwell, be prepared to present your client's response to these allegations." In the courthouse hallway, Sarah and I conferred quickly. "They're going to attack your credibility," she warned. "Be prepared for it to get ugly." When court resumed, Martin called Dad to the stand. He took the oath with practiced gravity, the picture of dignified professionalism in his navy suit and regimental tie. "Mr. Hayes," Martin began, "how would you characterize your relationship with your late wife?" Catherine and I had 28 years of marriage built on mutual respect and trust, Dad responded smoothly. Like any long partnership, we had our disagreements, but we always put family first. And the financial arrangements within your marriage? Catherine preferred that I handle our financial matters. She had many wonderful qualities, but financial management wasn't among them. This was a mutual arrangement that served us well for decades. He continued painting a picture of a harmonious marriage, disrupted only by Mom's illness and the unfortunate influence of individuals who took advantage of Catherine's vulnerable state to turn her against him. And your relationship with Madison Martin prompted. Dad's expression softened with practiced precision. I love my daughter deeply. Everything I've done has been to protect her interests even when she couldn't recognize that. The loss of her mother has been difficult for her, and I've tried to give her space while ensuring she doesn't make decisions she'll later regret. It was a masterful performance, measured, reasonable, tinged with just the right amount of paternal concern. If I hadn't experienced his manipulation firsthand, I might have been swayed myself. When Sarah stood for cross-examination, Dad's posture subtly shifted, almost imperceptible, but I recognized his battle stance from years of watching him prepare for tough cases. Mr. Hayes, Sarah began, you testified that your wife preferred you to handle financial matters. Yet we have numerous documents in her handwriting expressing frustration with your financial control. How do you explain this discrepancy? Catherine's medication affected her perception toward the end, Dad replied smoothly. She became suspicious of many things that had never troubled her before, including your appropriation of funds from her family trust. Dad's eyes narrowed slightly. I never appropriated funds. All transactions were legal and appropriate. Sarah approached with a document. This transfer of $600,000 from the Hayes Manufacturing Trust to your personal account on the 12th of March 2018, was that appropriate? That was a temporary transfer to manage a tax situation. The funds were later returned. 16 months later, and only after Catherine explicitly demanded their return according to her journal, Sarah produced another document. And this modification to the trust agreement, changing the distribution terms to favor your access, did Catherine agree to this? She signed the document, Dad replied, his tone hardening. Yes, but did she understand what she was signing? According to her journal entry from that same date, you told her it was routine paperwork for the accountant. For the first time, Dad looked slightly unsettled. I don't recall the specific conversation. Sarah continued methodically through a series of questionable transactions and manipulations, each time contrasting Dad's version with documentary evidence. His composure began to crack around the edges, answers becoming shorter tone, more defensive. Mr. Hayes, Sarah said finally, let's address the recording we heard earlier. You threatened to have your wife declared incompetent if she didn't comply with your financial demands. Was that also part of your mutual arrangement? That recording is taken completely out of context, Dad snapped. It was one moment of frustration during a difficult time. A pattern of moments, according to Catherine's journals. And now you're attempting to follow through on that threat posthumously by declaring her incompetent to make her will. Correct. Dad's face flushed. I'm protecting family assets from manipulation and undue influence. Whose influence, Mr. Hayes? Catherine was isolated from friends and family. According to her medical records and Dr. Wasserman's evaluation, she was mentally competent despite her illness. Who exactly was influencing her, other than her desire to protect her daughter from the same financial control she had experienced? Dad's control finally slipped. Catherine had no right to separate our assets. Everything we built was together under my guidance, my expertise. She would have had nothing without me. The courtroom fell silent at his outburst. Judge Martinez watched impassively as Dad struggled to regain his composure. No further questions, Your Honor, Sarah said quietly. Judge Martinez turned to Dad. You may step down, Mr. Hayes. As Dad returned to the counsel table, Martin requested a brief recess to confer with his client. Judge Martinez agreed to 15 minutes. When court resumed, Martin announced a change in strategy. Your Honor, given the evidence presented, my client wishes to address the court directly regarding a potential resolution. Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. This is unusual, but I'll allow it. Mr. Hayes. Dad approached the podium once again, the picture of control. Your Honor, it's clear that emotions in this unfortunate family matter have escalated beyond what's productive. In the interest of resolving this efficiently, I'm prepared to withdraw my petition contesting Catherine's will. provided certain conditions are met regarding the management of the assets in question. It was a strategic retreat, Dad recognizing he was losing and trying to salvage something from the situation. Judge Martinez turned to me. Miss Hayes, would you like to respond to your father's proposal? I stood heart-pounding. Your Honor, I appreciate my father's willingness to withdraw his petition, but I cannot accept conditions on what is legally and rightfully mine. Moreover, given the evidence of financial manipulation presented today, I believe the court should consider whether my father's actions warrant further investigation. Dad's head snapped toward me, eyes flashing with anger. You ungrateful, he began, then caught himself. Your Honor, I've dedicated my life to building security for this family. I made everything we have. Everything. Judge Martinez's expression remained neutral. Mr. Hayes, please control yourself. Dad approached the bench, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. Your Honor, there are aspects of this situation that haven't been presented. I strongly advise we discuss this privately in chambers. The judge frowned. Mr. Hayes, any relevant evidence should be presented in open court. This isn't about evidence, Dad hissed loud enough for those in the front rows to hear. This is about knowing how the game is played. You know me, Rebecca. You know how I operate in this courthouse. Was he threatening the judge? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stood up, moved by an impulse I couldn't explain, and walked to the bench. Your Honor, I said, may I approach? Judge Martinez, looking slightly stunned by Dad's behavior, nodded. As I reached the bench, Dad turned to me with cold fury. Stay out of this, Madison. You have no idea what you're doing. I leaned in close to him and whispered 2 words, tax fraud. Dad's face drained of color. On the USB drive, among Mom's other documents, I had found evidence of Dad systematically underreporting income and hiding assets for years. It was the one thing I hadn't yet revealed, the nuclear option. What did you say? Judge Martinez demanded, noticing Dad's reaction. Dad attempted to regain composure, but the damage was done. His face had gone from flushed to ashen in seconds. Your Honor, I said clearly, I have evidence that my father has been engaged in tax fraud for at least the past decade, using accounts connected to my mother's family trust. The documentation is in the evidence we've already submitted but not yet highlighted. That's a lie, Dad sputtered, but his eyes darted to his briefcase, then to the exit. Bailiff Judge Martinez said sharply, noticing his glance, please ensure Mr. Hayes remains in the courtroom. She turned to me. Miss Hayes, that's an extremely serious allegation. Are you prepared to substantiate it? Yes, Your Honor. The evidence is in Exhibit 34 pages 17 through 42. Judge Martinez rifled through the documents, her expression growing increasingly grave. Dad, seeing which way the wind was blowing, attempted to approach the exit only to be stopped by the bailiff. Mr. Hayes, Judge Martinez said, looking up from the documents, in light of this evidence, I am referring this matter to the appropriate authorities for investigation. Furthermore, your petition to contest Catherine Hayes's will is denied in its entirety. She turned to me. Miss Hayes, the court recognizes your rightful claim to your inheritance as specified in your mother's will. Additionally, given the evidence of manipulation and control, I am issuing a temporary restraining order preventing Richard Hayes from contacting you or interfering with your financial affairs in any way. Dad's face contorted with rage. You can't do this. I'll appeal. Mr. Hayes, Judge Martinez's voice cut through his protest like a blade. One more outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt. This hearing is concluded. As the gavel fell, I felt a wave of emotions, relief, vindication, and a profound sadness for what could have been. Dad stared at me across the courtroom, his expression unreadable now as Martin and the other attorneys huddled around him in urgent consultation. For the first time in my life, I met his gaze without flinching, without seeking approval. In that moment, I was finally free. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse closed behind me with a definitive thud. On the stone steps outside, reporters had already gathered word of Richard Hayes's courtroom downfall, spreading through Boston's legal community like wildfire. Miss Hayes, can you comment on the allegations against your father? Is it true that the IRS is investigating Richard Hayes? How long have you known about the alleged tax fraud? Sarah expertly steered me through the crowd toward a waiting car. No comment at this time, she repeated firmly. Miss Hayes will issue a statement through counsel when appropriate. Once safely inside the car, I leaned back against the leather seat and exhaled a breath I felt like I'd been holding my entire life. Is it really over? The will contest is over, Sarah confirmed. The rest is just beginning. The IRS and possibly the district attorney will want to speak with you about the evidence. There may be additional civil matters to address. But yes, the core battle is won. As we pulled away from the courthouse, I saw Dad emerging surrounded by his legal team like a protective shield. Our eyes met through the car window. There was no anger now, just a cold, calculating assessment, the look of a man already planning his next move. Back at my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the couch, emotionally and physically drained. The sudden silence felt both liberating and disorienting. For weeks, my life had been consumed by legal strategies, evidence, review, and constant vigilance. Now, in the quiet aftermath of victory, I found myself strangely unmoored. The next morning brought a surprise visitor, Thomas Bradford. "Madison," he said when I opened the door, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes rather than his usual suit. "I wanted to check on you. And to apologize." I invited him in, curious about what had prompted this visit. "I should have spoken up years ago," he said, sitting stiffly on the edge of an armchair. "I saw what Richard was doing to Catherine, to you, and I rationalized my silence as professional obligation. Why did you finally help me?" Thomas stared at his hands. "Your mother came to see me about 6 months before she died. She wanted legal advice about protecting assets from Richard, but she was terrified of him finding out. I referred her to another attorney, told her it was a conflict of interest." His voice thickened. "I should have done more." "You did eventually," I offered. "Too late for Catherine." He looked up. "You should know Richard is already working to contain the damage. He has connections at the IRS, at the district attorney's office. He's calling in favors." "Can he really make this all go away?" I asked, dismayed. "Not all of it. But he can minimize consequences, delay investigations. Richard has spent decades building a network of influence." "Then what was the point of all this?" Thomas smiled sadly. "You're free of him, Madison. That's no small victory." After he left, I spent the day fielding calls from Sarah with updates on legal proceedings from reporters, seeking comments from old friends who had seen the news and were reaching out in support or curiosity. Most surprisingly, I received a call from an unknown number that turned out to be Martin Blackwell. "Madison," he said, his tone professional but not unfriendly, "I'm no longer representing your father. I wanted you to know that." "Why are you telling me this?" "Professional courtesy." "And?" He hesitated. "I have a daughter about your age. What came out in court yesterday, it made me reconsider certain choices." It seemed Dad's behavior had cost him more than just the case. The days that followed brought a flurry of activity. Dad's legal troubles mounted as investigations into his financial dealings gained momentum despite his efforts to contain them. The IRS launched a formal audit, and the Massachusetts Bar Association opened an ethics inquiry. News reports painted the saga as either a daughter's brave stand against abuse of power or a family feud that had spiraled out of control, depending on the outlet's sympathies. I declined all interview requests, preferring to process everything privately. 2 weeks after the hearing, I received my first communication from Dad, a formal letter delivered by courier. "Madison," it began without greeting or sentiment. "My attorneys advise against this communication, but certain matters must be addressed. Your actions have triggered investigations that threaten to destroy everything I've built. If your goal was vengeance, congratulations on your success. Nevertheless, I remain your father. When your emotional response has cooled, I trust you will recognize that my guidance, however unwelcome you may find it, now has shaped you into the person you are. That guidance remains available to you should you reconsider your current path. The family home and its contents technically belong to both of us. I suggest we arrange an equitable division of personal property to avoid further legal entanglements. Richard Hayes." No signature, just his typed name. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology, not even a hint of understanding why I had opposed him. It was perfectly quintessentially Dad. I showed the letter to Aunt Eleanor when she visited the following weekend. She had flown in from Chicago, eager to reconnect and help me sort through the emotional aftermath. Classic Richard, she sighed after reading it. Even now, he can't admit he was wrong. Your mother used to say he'd rather burn down the house than admit he left the stove on. Aunt Eleanor helped me begin the process of healing, not just from the court battle, but from a lifetime of subtle manipulation. She shared stories about Mom I'd never heard from before. Dad had isolated her from her family. Catherine was fearless, she told me, as we sorted through old photos I'd rescued from the family home. She once took a solo trip through Europe after college, hitchhiked in places you definitely shouldn't hitchhike. She had this wild, adventurous streak that Richard systematically suppressed. I never saw that side of her, I said sadly. You saw glimpses, Eleanor insisted. The secret dance parties in the kitchen, the art museum trips, when Richard was away at conferences, the way she encouraged your interest in art history despite his disapproval. Those were acts of rebellion in her way. A month after the court decision, I began therapy with Dr. Linnea Carter, a psychologist specializing in recovery from emotional and psychological abuse. Our sessions helped me recognize patterns I'd internalized: the constant seeking of approval, the second-guessing of my own judgment, the belief that love was something to be earned through perfect performance. What you're describing is common in children raised by narcissistic parents, Dr. Carter explained. You develop a false self designed to earn approval while suppressing your authentic needs and desires. So how do I find my real self? I asked. She smiled gently. You already have. Standing up to your father was your authentic self breaking through. Now we build on that foundation. As spring arrived in Boston, I faced a decision about the family home. Dad had moved out temporarily, staying at a colleague's guest house while the investigations proceeded. The house sat empty, filled with memories both painful and precious. One sunny April morning, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house felt different now, no longer intimidating, just a structure of wood and stone. I wandered through the rooms, touching furniture, opening drawers, rediscovering pieces of my childhood. In Mom's closet, which Dad had cleared but not completely emptied, I found a small wooden box tucked on the highest shelf. Inside were mementos she'd saved from my childhood: drawings, school awards, photos Dad hadn't deemed worthy of displaying. A note attached read, "For Madison, reminders of who you really are." It struck me then that Mom had been fighting for me in her own quiet way all along, creating small sanctuaries of authenticity amid Dad's controlling environment. That afternoon, I called Sarah. I need to sell the house, I decided. I can't heal while surrounded by those memories. Are you sure? She asked. Legally, you could keep your half. I'm sure. I don't want to be tied to him through property or anything else. The decision to sell felt like cutting another cord that had bound me to my father's influence. Each step toward independence brought both anxiety and exhilaration, the discomfort of growth balanced against the joy of authentic choice. In early May, Dad's legal troubles escalated when the district attorney announced a formal investigation into potential financial crimes spanning more than a decade. The prestigious law firm of Bradford and Hayes began to fragment as partners distanced themselves from the scandal. Through it all, Dad remained defiant, issuing statements through his new attorney, claiming political motivation behind the investigations, and vowing to fight any charges. He continued attempting to contact me despite the restraining order, using intermediaries to deliver messages alternating between veiled threats and appeals to family loyalty. Your father called again, my assistant Jamie reported one afternoon. He said to tell you that family matters should be handled privately, and that there are still ways to resolve this that benefit everyone. I sighed, adding the message to the documentation we were maintaining. Just keep logging the calls, Jamie. Don't engage. As I began to process my inheritance, I discovered the full extent of Mom's planning. Beyond the financial assets, she had left detailed records of the Hayes Manufacturing Company's history, including innovations my grandfather had developed that were still generating patent royalties. It was a legacy I knew nothing about. One Dad had effectively erased from our family narrative. She wanted you to know where you came from, Aunt Eleanor explained as we reviewed the company archives. Your grandfather was brilliant but humble. Catherine inherited that quality, and so have you. 3 months after the court hearing, I received an unexpected call from the jail where Dad was being held pending trial on multiple charges of tax evasion and financial fraud. He had been denied bail due to what the judge termed significant flight risk and community connections that could impede the judicial process. Your father has requested to see you, the administrator explained. As a family member, you're permitted to visit if you choose. My first instinct was to refuse, but after discussing it with Dr. Carter, I decided to go, not for Dad's sake but for my own closure. The visitor's room at the Suffolk County Jail was stark and institutional, a far cry from the wood-paneled elegance Dad had surrounded himself with throughout his life. When he was let in, I barely recognized him. His designer suits had been replaced by standard-issue clothing, his carefully maintained appearance disrupted by institutional routine. Only his eyes remained unchanged, calculating, assessing, looking for advantage even now. "Madison," he said, taking the seat across from me. "Thank you for coming. Why did you want to see me, Dad?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This situation has gotten out of hand. My attorneys believe we can still reach an arrangement that would benefit both of us. No greeting, no asking how I was doing, straight to negotiation. Some things never changed." "What kind of arrangement?" I asked, more curious than interested. "If certain key documents were to become unavailable for the prosecution, their case would be significantly weakened. In exchange, I could ensure that additional funds not covered by the current investigations, could be transferred to you." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you seriously asking me to withhold evidence in a federal investigation? That's a crime, Dad." He waved dismissively. "A technicality. This is about family, Madison. About loyalty." "No," I said firmly. "This is about you facing consequences for your actions, maybe for the first time in your life." His expression hardened. "I gave you everything. A privileged upbringing, the best education connections most people would kill for. And this is how you repay me. You gave me things, Dad. Things with strings attached. That's not giving, it's controlling." "Ungrateful," he muttered. "Just like your mother at the end." I stood up. Mom wasn't ungrateful. She was finally seeing clearly. And so am I. "Where will you go?" he demanded. "What will you do without my guidance? You think having money makes you capable. You've been dependent on me your entire life." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a wave of pity. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about the money. It was about freedom." "Goodbye, Dad." As I turned to leave, he called after me, "This isn't over, Madison." But it was. At least for me. In the months that followed, I began rebuilding my life on my own terms. I established the Catherine Hayes Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of financial abuse and coercive control. The foundation offered both legal assistance and psychological support, helping others break free from situations similar to what Mom and I had experienced. I also reconnected with my passion for art history, enrolling in graduate courses I'd abandoned years earlier at Dad's insistence. The joy of studying something simply because I loved it without worrying about his approval felt like rediscovering a part of myself I'd buried long ago. The legal proceedings against Dad continued, complex and protracted, as he fought every charge with the considerable resources he still commanded. I provided testimony when required, but otherwise focused on my own healing and growth. 6 months after our courtroom confrontation, I sold the family home and purchased a light-filled apartment near the Charles River. The space was entirely my own, decorated according to my tastes, filled with books and art. I loved a physical manifestation of my newfound independence. On a crisp October evening, almost exactly a year after Mom's death, I invited Aunt Eleanor, Rachel, and a few close friends to a small housewarming gathering. As we sat on my terrace watching the sunset reflect on the river, Eleanor raised her glass. "To Catherine," she said softly, "who found her courage at the end and passed it on to her daughter." "And to new beginnings," Rachel added, squeezing my hand. Later, after everyone had left, I sat alone on the terrace with a box of old family photos. I selected one of Mom in her 20s, laughing hair blowing in the wind on a beach somewhere, before she met Dad, before the walls closed in around her. I placed it on my mantel, the first thing visitors would see upon entering. "We did it, Mom," I whispered. "We're free." The next morning, I received an email from Sarah with news that Dad's trial had been scheduled for January. The subject line read, "Thought you'd want to know." I stared at the message for a long moment, then closed my laptop without replying. Dad's story would continue to unfold, but it was no longer the story that defined me. I had my own path now, illuminated by the courage Mom had shown in her final act of love and protection. As I prepared to leave for my art history seminar, I paused at the door, looking back at my new home, a space filled with choices that were authentically mine. For the first time in my life, I wasn't seeking anyone's approval or validation. I was simply living as myself, discovering day by day who that person might be. And that, I realized, was the greatest inheritance Mom had left me, not the money or property, but the chance to live freely, to make mistakes, to follow my own compass. The journey ahead might not be perfect or precisely planned, but it would be mine. Sometimes, I still hear Dad's voice in my head, critiquing my choices, questioning my capability. But those echoes grow fainter with time, replaced by a stronger voice my own. I don't know if I'll ever completely heal from the years of subtle manipulation and control. Some wounds leave permanent marks. But I've learned that being whole doesn't mean being unscathed, it means embracing both the damage and the growth, the pain and the wisdom it eventually yields. If you're watching this and something in my story resonates with, you know that breaking free is possible. The path isn't easy or straight, but it's worth every difficult step. Trust yourself. Find your voice. Use it. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if this story touched you, and leave a comment sharing any experience you've had standing up to manipulation or control in your own life. Has anyone ever tried to make you doubt your own judgment or worth? How did you handle it? I read every comment and would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is simply to trust your own truth, even when the voices around you are trying to drown it out. Until next time, this is Madison Hayes, standing in my truth and wishing you the strength to stand in yours.